Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Turning the Tide on Climate. Last week, as you know, we talked about the Green New Deal, and tonight we're going to be talking about climate justice. As you already know, I'm Clark Mackey. Jude will be reading your questions from the chat. Just a very quick note. It turns out, what I understand, the problem with the Zoom link last week was that various email programs and the newsletter programs add additional gobbledygook to the Zoom link, and sometimes it ends up not working. And so the suggestion that was made to me is that if you have a problem with the Zoom link, you should just use the meeting ID and passcode, which come along with the link when we send it. So that's just a bit of advice to the Zoomers out there. If there is a problem with the link, try something else. Sometimes there does seem to be a problem with those links. So, and as usual, you know the routine, type your questions into the chat. Dr. Taylor will talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will read questions into the chat. And as usual, the seminar is being recorded. Kingston is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And we acknowledge that settler colonialism remains a problem today, as it has in the past. This is all very relevant to our discussions about climate change and climate justice. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Marcus Taylor, who is an associate professor in the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's. He's researched and written on questions of climate change adaptation and rural development with a focus on South India. He's written a book about the subject, and he is a contributing author to the new IPCC assessment report, Climate Change 2021. So it's a great pleasure to have him here tonight. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you.
Stop sharing and you can take over.
Oh, you bet. Thanks so much. Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for joining. And I believe you got to listen to my great colleague Kaila Tianhara last week. So hopefully I can continue moving the discussion along. I am going to share my screen. I don't have much in the way of slides, but what I do is a series of graphs to talk about the question of climate justice. So hold 1 second here. Okay, so I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with the idea of climate justice, and particularly understand that it comes out of an older discourse of environmental justice. And the idea of environmental justice, or particularly the idea of environmental injustice, has been a sort of long-standing feature of literature that pointed to the way in which particularly poor groups, and much of the environmental justice literature came out of the US to begin with, which pointed to those that more poor or marginal groups were often doubly hit, not only by their poverty or marginalization, but also tended to be exposed to environmental hazards or environmental pollutants in a more systematic way. And particularly some of this literature emerged in the context of urban USA, in which predominantly poor and racialized communities were often subject to polluting industries in their neighborhoods and so forth. And so this is the environmental justice theme was a way of opening conversations about what were seen to be social inequalities and social justice questions, along with an environmental lens. And this has now moved into the idea and sort of been taken up in the case of climate change. Now, I think one of the key things to think about within this is one of the ways we can sort of deepen this idea of both environmental justice and climate justice. And one of the ways it isn't talked so much about in the literature, because it's a bit of a thorny issue, is the way in which the sort of security and prosperity of some are sort of directly related to transferring costs onto others. So again, in the case of environmental aspects here, we'll be particularly thinking about the way that potentially the benefits of our current mode of living, our carbon-heavy lifestyles and so forth, are borne by some, but not just by accident alongside those that don't benefit so much, but rather the benefits are relational to pushing the costs on others. And this has been like a really key thing within the idea of climate justice, particularly the idea, and this is well established in the sort of literature, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, that the idea that those that have benefited least from sort of fossil fuel powered development, modernization, however we want to term it, are also those that are going to bear the biggest costs. And I've got some graphs later that will sort of really clarify that. But one of the things within that is not just that those that have done least to cause the problem are going to be most exposed to it, but also the part of the climate justice, which goes beyond perhaps some of the more mainstream institutional ways of doing this, is to say, hold on here, but the flip side of that is that those that benefit are directly related to passing the costs on to others. And this is a theme within climate justice. Is climate justice gives us, it doesn't give us any answers, but it asks us to ask these kinds of questions. Who benefits, how, why, and to what extent are those benefits bound up with passing the costs and the problems onto others? And it's that kind of relational aspect that's really important to the idea of climate justice. So within that, I think we need to think about the question of climate justice over various scales, both spatial scales. So we're talking about, are we talking about climate justice between countries, within countries, and so forth? And I'll talk this through. And also, to a certain extent, temporal scales between the here and the now and the past, who is responsible for past emissions, and obviously future generations. Now, these are huge questions, you know, and I'm only going to skim the surface, and hopefully I'm going to talk about two aspects: climate justice in terms of mitigation, that is reducing carbon emissions, and climate justice in terms of adaptation, that is the ability to transform societies in order to better withstand the shocks and stresses created by climate change. That latter is my own work, my own speciality. I work primarily in southern India, looking at rural communities, farmers facing climate change, etc. And I'll try and get to there in due course. I've got a few slides to get through before we get to there. So I hope you can all see these slides. So just, you know, broadly, the question of climate justice often sort of pivots on a graph like this, and this obviously shows the direction and the potential pathways for emissions and different decarbonization trajectories. So as you'll see, that within the sphere of the best measurements possible, and measurements vary, that's why we have bands on this graph, but current policies, where we are actually headed at the moment, is somewhere towards 3.3 to 3.8% degrees global warming compared to pre-industrial revolution. That's where business as usual is directing us. This is pre-pandemic, but all the signs are, that, at least I'm sure you're reading as much as me, is that whilst the pandemic caused a dip in emissions, that is likely to be just a very temporary thing, rather than a sustained process of decarbonization anyway. Now, if we look at the kind of pledges made in the Paris Climate Agreement, we'll see that those new pledges, if they are fulfilled, and very few countries are actually on track to meet their pledges at the moment, we'll be on a trajectory towards 2.5 to 2.7 degrees warming. And again, there's all the uncertainties around this, but you know, broadly, this is what we're talking about. And of course, the bottom one is where we would actually need to be in terms of a much more radical process of decarbonization of the global economy to hit that less than 2 degrees, and particularly the 1.5 degrees thing, which many scientists now say actually that's really where we should be aiming for to avoid really nasty impacts of climate change. course, we're not near there. But one thing, this kind of graph is very common to see, but obviously it doesn't look at differentiated responsibility. It kind of puts the world as one globe and says, right, this is what has to happen. And that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of thinking about it is, of course, about the question of climate justice, is about who should be responsible for making cuts and when. And evidently, that creates a huge political issue. So if we were just to look at it in terms of which countries are emitting at the moment on a sort of global scale, and again, these figures that, they come out of the UN, and we could debate over exactly how precise they are, but they captured a broad brushstroke, right? And this is just in percentage of global total emissions. And you might say, well, why does this seem to be only half an image? Don't worry, I'm not going to deprive you of the second half, but I wanted us to focus on the first half too. And then we'll get to the second half, okay, because it's interesting. So just in terms of percentage emissions, it's very clear that 3 countries are particularly prevalent in emissions. China, it's now the world's biggest emitter. United States, still right up there, and the EU understood as a bloc. I guess, I wonder whether Britain now is out of that or not. Anyway, we're not going to talk about Brexit right now, no. But EU 27, all the European countries, actually, that obviously goes beyond the European Union. And then if we even took just the top 10 emitters, we'd see that they are vastly responsible for something like 70–75% of the overall total of emissions. And this is, of course, just raw emissions. And that gives one place, if we think of climate justice as something between countries, that's an important, we can see who are the big emitters here. One thing to notice in figures like this is that they rarely look at the embodied carbon. And by that, I mean, China obviously is a major emitter of pollution, of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. But some of that is in the service of producing commodities, which immediately get shipped off to consumers in the West. And so if you wanted to reapportion some of this, and there's lots of ways of doing this and lots of debates methodologically, but some of those emissions in China are really purely to feed the consumption needs of Canada, US, EU, and globally, right? So that's an interesting wrinkle to put into this. We're thinking about where does responsibility go? But clearly, if you sort of add it up in bulk, you have to sort of say, well, you've got 3 big emitters here, and then a top 10, top 12, etc., which are major emissions. But of course, the question of climate justice obviously says, well, hold on here. We need to change this for the size of the relative populations. And that's when you get to a much bigger graph. You get the full graph here. Unfortunately, I can't see the right-hand side of my graph, but I'm stuck seeing my own face. But here we go. Suddenly things look very different, right? Here we start to see a whole set of different calculations in which the fact that China suddenly goes on a per capita basis of emissions from the top of the list right down right down the list, and then suddenly countries such as Australia and Canada soon to the top of the list, and it really shows our carbon intensive lifestyles, right? So per capita emissions suddenly makes things look in an entirely different light. And if you'll see at the right hand side of this graph is the kind of line that's been drawn to say that all countries, that this is what the average emission should be across globally if we're to meet a 450 ppm outcome, which would keep climate change much more manageable in the future. So you can see once the scale of the emissions, but also which countries would need to be dramatically decarbonizing quicker than the others. And a country such as India, you'll notice here, is right about that line in terms of, so it's a larger industrial, huge population, but in terms of its aggregate emissions, that's a big thing. So once we put per capita emissions on, suddenly the complexity of climate justice and which countries need to do what changes again. If we added into that past emissions, and this gets another thorny political problem, suddenly it changes once again, right? If we think about it this way, in terms of emissions since 1850, which has got the world to where it is at the moment, for good and for bad in many ways, you know, what we call modernity has been an artifact of the fossil fuel era, right? Mass production, mass mobility, mass consumption, and so forth. It's been predicated on the remarkable qualities of coal and oil to be combustible, to release energy so quickly, right? So here we see, you know, United States and the European Union taking over 50% of historical emissions, which of course powered their development, along with other things as well. And so as soon as you bring the historical contributions in, you can understand why debates at the Paris Climate Accords and so forth get really heated. India, for example, argues that, you know, went into the Paris Accords saying, why should we sacrifice our right to develop to meet questions of poverty, questions of material welfare of our citizens by, for example, stopping coal-fired power stations when, you know, historically we've done so little to deal with, to contribute to this issue. And in per capita terms, we're still way below those countries in the West. So, you know, India went into those accords saying, you know, that, yeah, climate change is a real problem, but it's not our problem. And they said, you know, we can't, as in we can't reduce emissions for development reasons. We are, the welfare of our population comes first. We won't for political reasons, and we shouldn't for ethical reasons. Now, a negotiation came to a head, and at some point they managed to do a reach agreement, which are called the Paris Agreements. But of course, the pledges within the Paris Accords establish a principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The idea it's everyone's problem, but there's differentiated responsibility to deal with it. And yet, you know, the Paris Accords set aspirational targets, of which at present no countries are meeting, and no legal enforcement mechanism to say, hey, countries in the West, you need to decarbonize quicker and more rapidly, etc. The rich countries were absolutely adamant that there would be nothing that can make them liable legally for this. And so that was a lot of the negotiation around the Paris Agreement. Now, you know, so historical emissions comes into this, where the past catches up. And of course, many rich countries said, well, we didn't know about this. You can't blame us for the past. But of course, climate change was known among some circles for a much longer period than many would like to admit, and including among the oil companies, as I'm sure you're aware of. So if we look at this graphically, you know, here we see it in spatial terms. These are the high emitting countries, and you notice it's preponderantly to the north and to the very south. And in the middle, there is not a lot of emissions going on. And we can counterpose this to the following map. So this is red countries are the highest emitting, green countries are the lowest emitting countries. And then if we look at this in terms of climate vulnerability, it is almost entirely the inverse, right? The colors have just switched. I mean, I'm just going to do that again because I don't quite like it. And it's frightening, right? Here's the emissions. Here's indices of which countries are more vulnerable to climate change impacts. And this is where the second thing of climate justice, we got the emissions side of things, we got the mitigation of how we reduce, and we've also got the question of where impacts fall and what can be done about it. Now, and obviously it's really stark here about the justice, the ethical questions. These two maps really hit it out. But there's one other thing I'd just like to throw on the table, you know, just for discussion and so forth. And that is, you know, a graph like this shows percentage of CO2 emissions by world population. The richest 10% in the world are responsible for pretty much half. And this is produced by Oxfam. Not a lot of organizations do this kind of breaking down, not country by country, but by tier of wealth. Yeah. And so really see that emissions is really concentrated amongst the higher wealth niches of the global economy. So here we see a kind of much more sort of like a class dimension, right? There, whereas, you know, within that, the global 1% will certainly be right up the top there. And so that puts a different complexity on this, because climate justice, we can think of it sort of between countries, but also within countries, we see massive differences in emissions. And if we actually looked at, and I've neglected to put this slide in the deck for today, but if we looked at Canada and emissions within Canada, we would see a graph which looks a lot like this. That is the richest 10%, and certainly the richest 20% in Canada, taking up over 50% of emissions. So, even so, if we say, all right, Canada has a responsibility, or US, to reduce its emissions compared to India and China. But then if we want to be more, complex about it, we say, actually, it's particular groups within those countries which are the high emitters. So it's not just a country vis-a-vis a country, but the justice thing gets wrapped up in, the expenditures, as it were, the elite classes within these countries are those that are emitting much more than the others, and that makes it even more complicated, right? So you've got this between countries, you've got the within countries things, and these questions, and then you've got the question through time, historical versus present versus future emissions. That's why climate justice is really complicated. That's why the international agreements try to really dodge many of these issues, but that's obviously where social movements come in to talk about them. So that's the mitigation aspect. And hold on, how am I doing for time? Oh, I've already taken my time up. I will just very briefly note that the other aspect of inequality that comes in is how climate change impacts are experienced on the ground. And this is actually the focus of my research. And who is more vulnerable to climate change impacts, and why? And the kind of research I've been doing over the past decade has particularly looked at southern India. And so that's why I've got this up on the map. That's why I got my background on, in part so you don't see my messy basement office, but in part because it's from this part of the world. And I've done a number of studies in which I look at projects which were granted money, typically by both international and national agencies, that were meant to tackle climate change impacts within the most vulnerable groups, which in this case, in looking at rural issues, are smallholder farmers who are clearly very exposed to a current era of increasing weather extremes. And just to be clear, these farmers are very used to weather extremes. Dealing with variable weather is an absolutely essential part of what they do. But climate change is currently, and has done over the last 10 years, made those extremes even more extreme. And that is pushing many of these farmers to the brink. And but what my book, and there's just some kind of photos from fieldwork to give you an idea of the kind of social and geographical cartography and landscapes that we're dealing with. The part of work that I've been looking at is the way that adaptation projects, that is monies that flow in with the ostensible objective of improving the climate resilience of these kinds of populations, often, and far too often, can actually reinforce inequalities on the ground. And it's a really problematic aspect. And a number of authors myself have been pursuing this, but we're particularly, so I'll just, I don't know, Clark, am I okay to give one quick example and then I'll stop?
Yes, no, go ahead and talk about that. That would be good.
Okay, cool. So one example, for example, when a drought hits in these kind of regions of southern India, now, as I mentioned, these smallholder farmers are used to a drought every 4 to 5 years. The monsoons would fail every 4 to 5 years, and that was always difficult to deal with. But they had mechanisms for working with that climate instability and the potential for it. Now they're finding monsoons can fail every other year, or you can get half a monsoon and then it just stops, or you can get no monsoon and then it starts halfway through. The level of instability in weather patterns, and this of course challenges the knowledge of how to deal with climatic instability that has been, built in over generations. It's taxed because the weather is not acting like they imagine it would, right? There's that old saying, it's like climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. well, no one knows what they're going to get right now. It's really, really frightening. And it really causes a lot of problems. So if, for example, with drought, and here's the key thing, when a drought occurs, it doesn't just hit farmers individually, it rather reconfigures how they relate to other farmers and other powerful people within a landscape. For example, when drought hits, many farmers have to sell assets to make ends meet, particularly if this is the second drought in 3 years, right? They can survive the first one, it's the second one that bites. So they do things like sell cattle, which is one of the few assets they might have, or goats. And of course, what can happen is when lots of farmers are selling cattle at the same time, prices plunge. And suddenly they're getting half of what they would have got for selling cattle, but they have no opportunity, no option but to sell, because they're in a really difficult situation. And of course, this is a huge opportunity for those with money, for those with mobility that have large trucks that can come in to rural areas, sweep in, pay distress prices for capital, and then ship them off to cities and sell them an absolute massive profit. So here you see how drought, and this comes back to this climate justice thing on the ground, really exacerbates the kind of inequalities going on. You get winners and losers through climate change that are directly related to each other. Looking at adaptation programs, regrettably, I've seen all too many adaptation programs that do not take that kind of issue of inequalities seriously. And as a result, they often end up inadvertently aiding some in a community, often those who already had more resources, and doing very little for others. For example, very quick, because I said that was my last example, I have one more. Often they involve, for example, agroforestry. And I was at one project 2 years ago looking at it. A wonderful example of reclaiming wasteland, building verdant orchards of mango, of cashew, of Indian gooseberry, brilliant adaptation success story. Until my co-author and myself looked a bit deeper and found that the farmers who'd had this wonderful transformation, all paid for by this adaptation program, were the 3 leading families in the village who already had the most land, the most access to water. And because the implementing agency needed, a 3-year turnaround from this project, we need success. They worked with the farmers who said, we'll guarantee you success, come work with us. We can give you gateways to all the other farmers in here. And they did. But by taking a massive cut off the top and becoming the primary benefits of a program which was meant to prove climate resilience for everyone. So I'll stop talking there. I've talked too long. I'm just giving you a taste of the kind of work we're doing. So we've got these global issues and climate justice, and then we got climate justice issues right down on like the micro levels of projects and so forth. I just try to give you a flavor of the big picture. Okay, thanks so much. I'll stop sharing my screen. Oh, I can't find my cursor. It's disappeared. Here. There we go. Cool.
All right, thank you. Wow, that was really illuminating. I learned a lot of stuff from that. I guess my question, before we get to the questions in the chat, my question would be, there must be people who are thinking about what to, it seems like a really big problem, right? As you pointed out. And I'm wondering, are there people that have some concrete suggestions about how to make sense of it and how to come up with something that's fair?
Well, if you're looking for easy answers, I hate to disappoint, but there is no such thing. These problems are massively complex. They're not easy to solve at any level, and particularly when we look at all these complex facets of climate injustice. And it's possible to try and ameliorate one aspect and end up exacerbating another. Now, in terms of the global emissions, the global mitigation kind of thing, that isn't the primary focus of my own work. Someone like Kyla last week probably had a much more robust way to talk about what the Green New Deal can and cannot do, and how it can combine social change with decarbonization and so forth. In terms of the adaptation side of things, which is where I'm looking at, it's really important. I don't, any adaptation program, by bringing resources into a community like this, which are very much needed, there's no doubt about that. And I should say, most programs do tend broadly to do a little bit of good for most, but because they're so unreflexive about how they impact upon things such as these power relations, that they tend to do a fair bit of problematic increasing of inequalities. And, I've looked at 3 of them now, and I see some very common lines. But I tell you, some projects, some programs really think about these questions explicitly. And they tend to be a lot better, a lot fairer in terms of how they work out. And it's a challenge to get development agencies, international development agencies, national development agencies, and so forth, to think in these terms, because it makes things messy, it makes things complicated, it means projects take longer because you need to really ask some deep questions before you just start going. And that all pushes against a kind of project mentality, which is common to most levels of government, whether it's India or Canada, which is, right, we've got 3 years for this project, I need like a log frame of results coming out for each month of the thing, and then we wrap it all up, put a bow on it, call it success, and walk away. There's a real tension here between the way government wants to do things, and governments of all stripes, not just, and a more sustained presence that can kind of say, hold on here, let's proceed reflexively with caution. So, a number of colleagues and myself are currently working on attempts to put best practice recommendations in. Had a meeting with the Norwegian Development Agency 2 weeks ago, and had an interesting back and forth. And some of them were like, oh yeah, we need to be thinking about it. Some are like, we don't want to think about that. We don't want to think about inequality. We can't deal with that. Just let us do things that work. I'm saying, well, hold on, you don't know if they work if you don't think of these things, So it's interesting. There's a particular culture, and there's clearly conflicts within development agencies. And the Norwegian one is relatively more progressive than, say, US aid. So these, but there's no easy solutions at all, for sure. But at least if we're reflexive about these issues, we might get better solutions or better ways forward. Perhaps solution is the wrong term, right?
And it sounds like it does have to do a lot with building relationships with communities, and also listening to the community, taking time to learn what is going on in the community.
It certainly is, although it does depend who you listen to in a community. You inevitably come across people who speak for the community, and sometimes they are actually speaking very well for the community and so forth. But sometimes they're in a position of relative privilege, and they don't necessarily voice the interests of the community. And that's really hard. That's why you have to take the time to understand, because those are generally the easiest people to work with on the ground, because they have the power to influence everyone else, because they're a large landowner or a merchant who everyone is in debt to. I mean, that would be very typical in rural India, right? So no one will talk against them. I mean, they might just about implicitly on the side if you're really lucky, but broadly they have a position of power, and people sort of gravitate around their orbit because they know that a development project will come and go, but this person's going to be there. And when your crop fails and you need an emergency loan, you'll go to this person to get it. And so forth and so forth. The whole set of social and cultural things. So yeah, listen to the community, absolutely. But just thinking going local is a solution, I agree with it. Subsidiarity in principle, but only if we think about these power relationships and how you work with these powerful people in communities. And there are ways of doing it that you might not get ever around the problem. There's definitely better and worse ways of doing it, and I've really seen some of the worst ways in practice. So I'm quite hopeful that development agencies will sort of cotton onto this. It's a long-standing issue. It's not new, but it's real.
Okay, I think we're going to just pass it over to Jude Larkin now, who's going to give us some questions from our attendees. Jude?
Yes, let's get some questions from the chat window. So the first one is, do the emissions by country include military emissions?
In the past they didn't. That's a good question. Military emissions, I think they're likely to capture some of them just by the implicit way that power and so forth is generated. A lot of it goes to military expenses, but that kind of global military footprint, you're probably right. It's not counted. It's not counted by the agencies, the militaries themselves, because they don't want people to know that. So it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I don't think it would be a massive game changer in how those emissions looked. And of course, the two biggest militaries are going to be, well, the US, China, Russia in terms of emissions. They're likely to be fairly high, which are already fairly highly emitting countries. But yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think you're right. I think a lot of military emissions will be on the dark side of the ledger and not counted. I don't think it would make a huge difference globally, but I could be wrong. I mean, it could be substantive. But yeah, you're probably right about that.
Now, next question. Can you see any path to a future where countries or individuals take legal responsibility for their emissions?
Well, again, at the moment, I think there are some signs to this. I mean, the amount of activism around climate is forcing some companies and institutions to take responsibility, to pledge to reduce net zero and so forth. Now we can all debate about the value of net zero pledges. I mean, on one hand, really tried to push and work to get Queens to take responsibility for its emissions and, being involved in the divestment campaign and so forth. And particularly now Queen's got a new pension joint with U of T and Guelph, and I'm working with colleagues in both other institutions to try and push Queen's to have firm commitment to both get their money out of oil and get it pledged towards decarbonisation goals. However we look at that, and obviously there's better and worse ways to do it, but it's a real struggle. And you'd have thought, gosh, if you can't get bloody Queens to do this, and there's some signs, but they push back, and a lot of it is the influence of the oil industry, the alumni, the pressure behind the scenes. I've been told this explicitly. So it's a real struggle, but I think we're seeing, winds of change that are really important. A lot of the finance industry does not want their assets to be stranded. So even if they would be normally a natural ally of fossil fuel production, I think they're getting scared. And I think that is a lever for change. Now, left to their own terms, they won't do it quick enough or fast enough or well enough. But that, with the kind of movement that you guys represent and is going on, does suggest. Now, is it a legal responsibility? At the moment, it's all voluntary, right? So that's a big question. A legal responsibility. I'm not sure. I mean, there's been some innovative suits, right? Legal suits. I mean, there's, a Peruvian village suing the German government for fossil fuels. I'm not sure that's going to get too far, but if one of them did succeed, it would be quite precedent setting. That's a way that it might happen. I'm not sure. You guys probably have some better examples than I do. At the moment, it will be about, political pressure. I can't see a legal aspect, but that could change. It could.
Yeah, at the moment it seems a bit like a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Is Canada's huge impact mainly due to oil and gas? I think maybe she means our oil and gas industry. I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is energy production, and particularly, obviously, the tar sands. No, we call them oil sands now. Yeah, a massive. So both the production of fossil fuels, particularly the Alberta situation, that's a real bit of carbon ready come up, and just the general production of power and fuel, etc. That is the bulk of Canada's emissions. Absolutely.
Next question. What can we say to friends or family who say the most efficient way to beat climate change is to change the political class, but are unable to recognize that we are all emitters and are all part of the problem as well?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, yes, this issue can destroy families, can't it? There's a few people I might not be talking to. So I feel your pain. I hear you loud and clear. What can we say? Well, on the one hand, I think it is important to note that we are all part of the problem, but we're not all equally it. And this is really thing that the concentration of consumption among, you know, particularly the top 5% of the Canadian population in terms of the energy use and so forth really is conspicuous by how much more they use than the rest. So there is actually a suggestion that this is an elite consumption issue. Now we are, of course, all part of the problem, and we need, but ultimately, I think, and this as hinted at with your, we need to change the political class. We need to change political ideas because there's no individual solution to this, right? It has to be a collective one. I mean, we can all do the right thing, cut down our emissions and so forth. But ultimately, if the whole infrastructure of Canada and elsewhere isn't reworked to make life more local and deeply decarbonized, then there's not that much individuals can do. And that isn't to suggest we shouldn't do anything. Of course, we should cut our emissions and think consciously about that. But it needs that kind of collective aspect. And evidently, that doesn't sit well with the plans to keep exploiting natural gas and oil resources, bitumen and so forth. So yeah, the most immediate aspect of what Canada can do is really scale that down. I mean, it has to stay in the ground, and that's a tough one for all the political reasons that you guys are far more familiar with than I am. But it's hard. But ultimately, I think, you know, I've learned to not let those arguments with family get to the point where you're really torching the relationships, because ultimately the bigger question is a collective one, and not that it should back down from those discussions, but you know, it's not worth the individual collateral damage of some relationships, is my personal feeling within that.
Okay, what policy changes can governments make to redress inequalities caused by climate change?
Well, that is a good question. As the big question in the Paris Climate Agreement, there was this principle of common differentiated responsibility, and part of that was that governments in the West, the high emitting countries and the more wealthiest countries, were going to expand funding to countries that had done least to cause the problem, and yet were bearing bigger costs. And this has been called something that's called an adaptation apartheid, in the way that the countries that are higher risk also have the least amount of resources in order to deal with the problem, right? And so to overcome that adaptation apartheid, where there was meant to be streams of money going to the developing world effectively to do this. Now, some of that money is in play. Goodness knows what COVID retrenched austerity budgets will do for it. It's a big question. I know that the British government has already sort of scaled back its overseas development funding and so forth. I'm not sure where Canada was with that and so forth. But the idea was over the next 20 years, we see a major increase in that, to deal with the justice, to deal with the ethical issues. But it's a big if. Once again, those promises made under the Paris Agreement are non-binding, non-enforceable, both in terms of reducing emissions and also in providing financing for this kind of stuff. So it's a big issue, but you know what? I mean, beyond that, the biggest task for Canada to do is not emit more carbon. Not, you know, there's ways they can contribute to helping the problem and the rest of the world, but not creating even bigger problem would be a better way to start beyond that. And so that's why, obviously, the oil sands is the big question, and we'll start there really, I think.
Okay, this is a long one. Okay, your early graph, the one which had the right side of per capita emissions, clearly shows that our lifestyle consumption patterns are the problem. Just getting a plug-in car isn't going to change that. How do we get the message across, or even just start talking directly about how we have to change? Who is willing to truth tell?
Well, it sounds like you, like me, been wondering about this. And obviously, the plug-in car is, a start, but we really need a thorough transformation of energy, of housing, of transport. And those things are big, and particularly when projects keep getting built that lock in the opposite, lock in car-driven transport, lock in, luxury, sprawling cities and so forth. We're still a long way from making the kind of changes that look 20 years down the line and say, hold on, we really need to promote major efficiency housing. We need to be thinking about, carbon negative buildings and so forth, not just, more efficiency, but really think another way. And, even at Queen's, again, I'm on a lot of committees to do with sustainability policy and so forth. It's an uphill battle to get those in the top to commit to really ambitious things that 20 years on will pay off massively, but aren't the immediate priority. So it's a huge battle. Some people are really really willing, and others are much more cautious, and they really haven't grasped the transformation that's necessary. They think this kind of incremental stuff is going to be okay. And that's a really hard battle to think, because obviously it does involve sacrifice, does involve trade-offs between other good, worthy ways of spending money and many not so worthy ways of spending money. But, Kingston agreed to declare a climate emergency, etc. Well, quite how that is shaping out in policy vis-a-vis housing, vis-a-vis roads, etc. We'll still build another bridge across the river to, lock in transport in that way, right? So it's a huge thing, really hard to say. I believe there's a bigger appetite amongst it for those of the younger generation. And part of this is a generational thing. But it's really hard, because if you push the doom and gloom angle too much, or we're all complicit and we all need to sort of sacrifice this and this, it's a hard political sell. So the kind of strategy and tactics are used is difficult. But at the same way, I think people are starting to gather with the scale of climatic emergencies that are going on that are really scary, and they're just one after the other. There's no real looking away. Well, unless you run a news network in the United States, when apparently you can just look away from this. But elsewhere, there's not really much looking away. And I think public opinion is changing, and it's changing possibly quite quickly. Let's fingers crossed about that. But even amongst the sort of where you'd imagine people would be really on board, but Queen's, budgets are budgets. And one situation where what the new buildings, and I was there with a bunch of engineers, and so, well, it looks really pretty, but surely that brick face there can't be very efficient. And it's like, yeah, it's not very efficient, but the architect loved it. Oh, come on, guys, how aren't we past the point where we can build a building and still do that because the architect loved it, when it's clearly inefficient in terms of energy use? How can we still, in 2019 that was, be having that discussion? But we are. So it's uphill. Sorry, I'm not sure that was a very good answer to the question, but I think it's one that we are all struggling with. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely generating ideas in my head. Are there some development agencies that do look at making their work equalize rather than deepen inequalities?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And you know, part of the problem with many development agencies is they still haven't got past development in the old style model of increasing production, increasing consumption as the way to increase welfare. So many smaller development agencies, and not necessarily the national ones, but the NGO sphere, are much more into solidarity work, are much more into attempts to create more resilient and circular economies at a local level and so forth, and very much are into long-term relationships with community populations. But this is a smaller strata, right? Whereas the big money is getting pushed through the big agencies that then push it on to large development NGOs that have this kind of, right, we've got a 3-year horizon, 4-year horizon to make change happen. And it's like, some change can happen in that, but not all of it's going to be good. And but there are pressing issues that dealing with questions of poverty. Many governments in the developing world are like, that climate change thing is really problematic, but we still need to develop. We've got to increase incomes, got to provide more jobs, more livelihoods, and for the time being, carbon-powered energy is kind of key to that. So there's questions about whether within the developing world you can sort of skip level of technology and move straight to renewables. There's some hopes that solar power might be able to do that. Evidently, many parts of rural India would be very good for solar power. You're starting to see it. But at the same time, like, those big coal-fired power stations are like, for countries dealing with energy poverty, it's like candy. It's really hard to say no to, So there's that issue going on. And so, sorry, I'm drifting away from the original question. Not all development agencies are the same. In a couple of weeks' time, talking to the Swedish Development Agency, which is known to be a bit more progressive. So hopefully I'll have a good conversation there. Part of the problem in Canada is that CEDA got abolished and folded into trade and industry and all of that kind of thing, like in Britain, which really weakens the mandate that development isn't just about business. That's a hard one. I really wish they hadn't done that here, but they did. So yeah, but there is a lot of variability, and I'm sure you're very aware of some very good development organizations, NGOs, that do have a much better approach to this issue. But there's bigger issues about what life should look like, huge normative issues, and whether development, as we kind of see it into our imagination, is an illusion in some ways, and if so, what kind of social systems should replace it? That's a pretty big question, isn't it? But it's one that's at the tip of everyone's tongue when we talk about transformational change. Or transformational to what, and who's allowed to tell whom what their idea of transformation is? It's a big question. Sorry, that was again a very wide answer to a very good question.
Well, that's good. You're enlarging our perspectives. Could you comment on the Bill Gates style of climate mitigation? He sounds dangerous.
Certainly. Well, Bill Gates likes to be the enlightened technocrat, the guy that's going to come up with all the technical fixes to solve all these issues. And he's a firm believer in this kind of enlightened despotism with someone with massive amounts of cash that believes in his own mythology of having, self-built himself and therefore being a place to solve the world's problems, without realizing seemingly that he is part of the problem, that massive concentration of wealth that he's sitting on is a huge part of the reason why we're in the trouble we're in. So, it's a very self-reinforcing rhetoric of finding the smart solutions, right? So Gates is a huge promoter of a new green revolution in Africa. So trying to get African agriculture to modernize, to use fertilizers, genetically modified crops, hybrid seeds, and all these kind of things with really, really variable results. And again, I'm not against GMO crops per se, but I find them entirely useless for most of the things that we should want to think. And I know that there's different ideas on GMO, etc. It's the wrong answer to the questions we're asking at the moment, but it's one that really fits that technocratic, managerialist, top-down, we'll solve this through technology. Now, the big thing that Gates is going to gamble on is the idea of technologies that can suck carbon from the air. And, you know, this is like the silver bullet that we could preserve everything that we have at the moment, so long as we can find these innovative technologies to sequester carbon from the air. It is pretty fanciful at the moment, if you think about it, to be able to create an infrastructure that can actually suck out carbon and sequester it on the scale that we emit carbon would have to be every bit as big. So we would have to come up with an industrial infrastructure equivalent to all the industry that we currently have, just to get the carbon out of the air so we can keep putting it in the air. So, you know, that's why the at scale carbon sequestration is a really, really, really hazy thing. It would be, I mean, it'd be wonderful if it could be developed. Maybe I'm just too cynical, but there is very little so far to suggest that it is the kind of magic ticket. If nothing else, to build the kind of infrastructure to sequester carbon at the rate we emit it would require a whole lot of a carbon intensive industry to produce that industry, right? So it's really, so, you know, but Gates is all about efficiency, and efficiency will drive down emissions and so forth. And it's kind of avoiding making hard choices. It's the kind of thing that everything will change at a technological level so that socially we can just stay exactly the same, which when you're a billionaire, probably, you know, it's the reason you gravitate to that kind of solution. Sorry, a bit of a rant, but I think that's what you were looking for with that question.
Lots of good questions here. So I don't know if we'll make it all the way through, but the next one, will we continue to try to offshore our emissions?
Depends who the we is there. I'm guessing Canada, and obviously, well, we offshore our emissions for the production of, you know, all sorts of consumable items from China and other areas of India and Bangladesh for our clothes and so forth. Although we're not offshoring our emissions so much in terms of the natural gas and oil production, right? I guess, you know, in the rhetoric of the oil industry itself, extracting tar sands is better because it can perhaps replace some coal-fired power plants in Asia, so therefore it's part of the solution. But obviously, you know, I doubt that kind of rhetoric is working with you guys. I think, you know, it's certainly a very problematic argument and so forth. So offshoring in that way, yes, unless we start to say, hold on here, maybe this mass consumption deluge of pretty worthless consumer crap that we are bathing in every day is perhaps we can live a little more modestly. And that's probably very easy for me to say that because, you know, I'm certainly drawing a salary from a university that put me in a higher echelon, etc. For many, you know, in Canada, etc., there's no such luxury to be able to say should consume less. But that's part of it. There needs to be a sense of a tax on the wealthy, specifically for their consumption of items that are carbon intense. And we need that. We need that clear. We need it big time. It's going to be really hard. Just look at the political furor over gas tax, etc. But that's, you know, a flat tax that doesn't hit those that are most emitting hard enough, right? It's not targeted, it affects everyone. And it's that kind of question of differentiated responsibility, even here in Canada, that perhaps isn't on the political agenda so much. Perhaps it needs to be more, but you guys are the guys that are absolutely pushing that. So I'm not gonna say that to you, you know that, but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here, Jude, just because it is 8 o'clock. But Marcus, would you be willing to stay a little bit longer and answer a few of the other questions?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and just talk about next week. And then we can go back and respond to some more of those questions. So just for those of you who have to leave now, next week is Dr. David, pardon me, Dr. David McDonald talking about renewables and their discontents. So this is your chance to get into it. This is something that came up in Kyla's talk. And this is going to be a whole night of talking about renewables. So
this is great. David can solve all the problems that we're raising here. I love this. This is so good.
Well, we'll see. But anyway,
tell him I said that. Tell him I said that.
I will do that. I'm going to do that. All right. So I'll stop sharing. We'll go back to Marcus so there looks like there's some more questions there, Jude.
There sure are. Can you give us more informed view about current Indian farmers' protests? How much do they engage the more vulnerable, or are they again led by the more wealthy farmers?
Okay, yeah, great question, big question, and I'm happy to talk about this, and I'll try to be relatively brief because it is a more complex issue than sometimes it's painted in the media. And obviously in the Indian media, there's a huge political question. Protesting farmers are protesting, just so we're all on the same page, against a new set of laws about agriculture that are introduced in a very top-down, non-consultative way by the government. And right at the moment, India has a system whereby farmers, in theory, are guaranteed a minimum price for their crops, or at least the major crops, your rice, your wheat, and corn, and so forth. So technically, if you're in that field behind me here, you grow your crop, you could go to the government and say, here's my crop, or you'd go to a miller, here's the crop, pay me the government price, and you'd get that. And it's meant to be set at a relatively remunerative level, so it meets your costs and so forth, and affords you a little bit of profit. And then actually the government takes those stocks of food, and some of them they redistribute through ration centers as part of the public distribution system. So those in need can go to the government ration shops and get a portion of heavily subsidized or even free staple produce. So this is a system that's been going on in India for quite a while. It's very imperfect, but it is a system that tries to say there is a right to food. And a right to food means that the farmers have a right to produce food at a certain level, a certain crop, etc. So a lot of the protests are centered around the northwest, around the Punjab and other areas, Haryana, etc. And they have really opposed dismantling of this system. And the idea of the government was that this will create, a free marketplace for crops, etc. So those farmers that produce will be able to produce directly for national or international food conglomerates. They'll get better prices and so forth, and the state is inefficient and so forth. It's a fairly neoliberal kind of strategy. So the farmers that are protesting against it are ones that are working under a green revolution model in Punjab, etc., where this is the breadbasket of India particularly. And it was the area where the green revolution in terms of fertilizers, in terms of hybrid or high yield variety seeds were introduced, etc. And all of that requires a whole lot of water, and not just under climate change, but just the amounts of water they've been sucking from the ground are not being replenished there. So agriculture in Punjab was already at a crisis point because of the environmental aspects of this. And across India, farming has been very unremunerative, and farmers have been really hard hit. And they've sort of been lost in the sort of idea of growing urban India, Indian miracle, and so forth. So many of the farmers that are protesting are perhaps some of the bigger and more medium ones. But I would say that the smaller farmers are pretty opposed to these things as well, although it's certainly the bigger ones that have the political clout to mobilize this way. Now, the smaller farmers and the ones that I've talked to a lot in southern India, etc., they don't get those government prices. So they're not actually protesting or lending their support to this because they like the system as it is. The reason they don't get those prices is if you sell to the government, it takes a long time for the government to pay you. And most of the farmers that I'm interviewing with, much smaller, just a couple of hectares at most, don't have time to wait because they need to pay back debts. They go into debt at the beginning of the year, and they need to pay that back at the end of the year. And if you go through the government support system, You can't get that. And what they end up doing is taking debts from middlemen who they sell their crop to at the end, and that's the condition of taking that loan, at a reduced rate below the minimum price. So below, you know, it's like working below the minimum wage, or selling your crop below the minimum price, because then they get paid back. And then they know that that person will lend them more money at the beginning of the next season and so forth. So most farmers don't get the minimum support price. So they're not actually protesting in favor of the current system. Everyone knows that it's very badly wrong. But what they're sort of saying is, it doesn't work for us. We're still at the mercy of these middlemen, etc. But they tend to be relatively local middlemen who we know how to deal with, and they exploit us. But it's a kind of exploitation that we know. And what they're frightened of is that the reforms will blow this right open, and there'll be even bigger sort of predatory firms coming in. And there'll be even less support. I mean, at least the minimum support price means that they can negotiate with these middlemen and say, well, you can't fall that far below the minimum support price. We rip that away, the open market, etc. So for the smaller farmers, it is really about saying, we don't like the system we're in, but we think what you're coming up with will basically screw us even worse than the current system, not to put too fine a point on it. So, you know, that's kind of going on. You know, there's various different sort of ways of approaching this issue that many farmers are doing. Most of them kind of vote with their feet. They'll keep farming more or less for subsistence, but they hope to have younger members of the household go and get urban work, either in local towns or in local cities, whether it's construction, factories, services, etc. And they hope maybe their grandchildren to get enough education to get a government job, which is even more secure. So farming becomes a little reserved, but there isn't where the household is based on their income anymore, because you just can't make enough money. But they particularly, some of those farmers very interestingly are saying, all right, if we're not trying to like make a huge profit on the market, well, let's go back to those more organic techniques, you know? And because that way we don't spend a ton on fertilizer, pesticide, herbicide, seeds at the beginning of the year, we can actually minimize all those costs. And we don't get the same yield at the end of the year. But if this is only one part of our livelihood, that's a much more risk averse way of farming. So we're actually seeing this process in which farming is actually, there's a really big movement around southern India about natural based farming, or it's what's called zero budget natural farming, which means you don't like invest in all the chemicals at the beginning of the year. And it's kind of like an organic revolution by inadvertently. And then what they're doing it is because they don't want to get into debt, because you have to go into debt to buy the pesticide, the fertilizer, and all that stuff. And they say, we don't want to do that. So they're kind of gravitating towards the other thing by default. But it's really interesting to see. And it's not everywhere, but it's certainly picking up steam. And I think it's really important because a more diversified form of farming will be much more resilient against the kinds of climate change impacts we're seeing. So this is a huge issue of interest to me, and you know, looking at what climate resilient farming means and different models of it is really a lot of what I'm trying to do at the moment, and come up with some, you know, some ideas around this and look at different narratives about what resilient farming is. Yeah, sorry, I hope that puts some light on the farming protests and so.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear about that organic movement for practical reasons.
Yeah, it's certainly there's a lot of farmers, you know, it's interesting. Those that do have at least a bit of security of another income in the household would generally prefer to do that. And it's one of these things where if it happens on a bigger scale, it will be self-reinforcing. A lot of the problem that a smallholder farmer has in cutting down in the sort of synthetic industrial type of farming is that if, you know, you can try and develop a sort of more biodiverse form of farming, bring life back to the soil. But if you're doing it in just, you know, 1 hectare, and your neighbors on either side of you are spraying chemicals everywhere, there's you know, it tends to defeat what you're trying to do. So it really requires, because of the small nature of holdings, a number of people to be doing it on a more landscape type of level, and then it can actually produce over a number of years and yields can come up, because you're going to take a hit in the yields once you get rid of the chemicals to begin with. You're always, it takes a while to bring the fertility back to the soil, etc. So not a lot of farmers in southern India have 3 years to wait for yields to pick back up. And that's one of the main challenges about the sort of alternative agriculture there. It's just simply time. I know farmers that said, yeah, well, I tried it for a year, yields were really bad, I would have stuck with it, but I can't afford to. So that's a huge issue, and that's something policy really needs to look at. If they're serious about alternative agriculture, and some parts of Indian politics really are, then they need to be able to support that transition period, because farmers can't afford to. Money talks, they're in debt. But it's really attractive to them because you can get rid of all those expensive inputs at the start, and which leave you socially indebted to all these important people in the villages around you that give you the money, but tie you into all sorts of social obligations and so forth. It's interesting kind of scenario. So yeah, debt is a huge thing.
And this person's asking, would carbon border adjustments help international climate justice?
Ooh, carbon border adjustments. I'm not actually sure of the term, so this is interesting. I'll have to go and read about that. But clearly, if carbon sort of budgets or carbon emissions were actually included, those embedded quantities of carbon within goods. So right now, most of the ways for accounting for carbon budgets or carbon emissions, say a television produced in China counts as China's emissions. But if that television comes straight over to Canada and used here, shouldn't that be part of Canada's carbon budget? So if that's the kind of thing, that kind of embodied carbon in consumer goods, etc., if that were to be counted, would that make a difference? I think it would help. It would certainly sort of show that a global economy predicated on producing things the other side of the world really is at odds with the kind of carbon accounting mechanism. I'd see that as positive. And some people are doing that kind of modeling of quite how much carbon is embodied in those projects, and showing what that would mean for those kind of graphs I showed earlier. Some people are doing that work. It's very interesting. It's a long way from becoming accepted as a way of counting carbon budgets and so forth, but it absolutely should be. I did see one comment in the chat to say put in a good word for Interpares, and yeah, absolutely. Interpares, USC, now known as Sea Change, two really good Ottawa NGOs that are doing really great solidarity orientated work. Yeah, absolutely. Amongst others, those two known to me that are doing great stuff.
And could you please talk more about carbon negative buildings?
Yeah, well, at the moment, most building codes are looking at question of efficiency. So just how much is, how well does the building conserve energy and so forth, how much you need to heat it and to run everything within it. But evidently, I think we need to come to a point where the building code says how much energy can a building actually generate, so that it can perhaps undercut what it expends. So we're talking here questions such as solar roofs, and particularly that kind of question, can we reach a point where it's impossible to put up a building in Kingston without integrating some kind of solar aspect onto the roof within reason? We're not there. And could that ever make a building carbon negative? Possibly. Depends, there's a lot that has to go on for that. But just making it as efficient as possible so it doesn't leak heat out is one thing, and that's brilliant. We should be doing that. But we should be looking at the energy generating potentials of our roof space. And once again, unless there's a political collective decision to say we need that. At the moment, most regulations will try and put in codes for energy loss, and Queens has signed up for that. The LEED standard, if you've heard of that, I'm sure many have. But we really need to be pushing beyond that. And this is what I'm saying about making investments now, Because if you wait 20 years to doing this stuff, it's too late, isn't it? You have to be ahead of the curve with this. QBAC, the Queen's Back in Action on Climate Change, have pushed the administration to really up their game on lead standards, etc. And I think in the next meeting of Queen's Sustainability Working Group, hopefully they'll come back to us with an answer about that. It would be good if they did. But again, administrators don't like to have their hands tied, and we want to tie their hands. It's a political struggle. Yeah.
I'm just going to add here that in 3 weeks we do have an environmental architect going to be talking about zero carbon buildings.
Excellent.
And things like that. So we're going to have a whole night on that. And I think it's 3 weeks from now.
Beautiful.
Okay, I see one more question, which is, would a basic income guarantee help in the return to natural farming?
Ooh, here? That's interesting. I mean, the organic farmers I know around Kingston, and many of you probably, I think probably actually thinking about the questions probably directed more to the Indian stuff, but it's probably, is it possible to pay a premium for food which is produced in a way that's regenerative, right? You probably heard of this term, regenerative agriculture. And part of that is a form of agriculture that can start to re-sequester carbon in the soil. And will we pay for that? Because obviously a grain of rice or a grain of wheat, which is produced one way or the other way, looks identical, presumably tastes identical, give or take, etc. So is there a way that we can do that? And of course, there's a start of a movement towards this kind of thing, whereby climate financing is being directed towards farms that claim to be more climate neutral, and therefore, they certify these things, and then they give investors that are looking to offset their own emissions, dirty industries elsewhere, say, well, you paid in for a climate neutral farming here, so your farmer gets a bonus for doing that, and you get to continue polluting elsewhere. That's the current model that's starting to take home. I hope we can go a little bit better than that. I hope we can get to a situation in which there's a kind of political regulation to say that actually that's what all farmers should be doing, and we should be penalizing those that aren't, rather than allowing polluters to reward those that are, but at the cost of allowing them to get certificates for offsets for their own pollution. So yeah, this is the moment we're at, is that yes, there's some change, and yes, paying farmers for it is, but if you allow the polluters to pay the farmers for doing this just so they don't have to cut their emissions so much, that's not going to be transformative in my book. So it's a bigger question, and it's here in Ontario, the idea of sustainable agriculture at a policy level is brutally undercooked. I mean, they just think it means like farms that don't go bankrupt. It's got nothing to do with climate, etc. So it's a struggle here. It's perhaps a bit further in India, purely because the distress in agricultural areas is so large that they desperately need other models, and farmers themselves are saying, if you can give me something that works, that I don't have to go into massive debt and risk that thing of going into debt, and if drought ruins my crops, I'm destitute, then I'll try it, even if for the first 3 years there's less yield, etc. And there's a lot of debates about, where are yields under this kind of agriculture and so forth. Obviously, if you want to grow just a field of wheat or a field of corn or a field of rice, it's not going to be as much yield, but diversified farming could produce a wider array of crops which can match those yields, but it's not just that, one thing. So, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought there, but would a bit basic income, would that help? I think so. Yeah. A lot of the worry about moving towards, this kind of transformative thing is that the trade-offs, the costs are borne by those that can't afford to do it. So if you take some of the stress out of that, I think people will be very much encouraged to agree to these kind of transformations. Yeah, I think it would be a very good idea, whether we're talking here or in India.
Well, I just want to echo one of the people who's made a comment in the chat. This has been amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for giving such a detailed view into how climate change is affecting the people of India.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Sorry if I went off on tangents at various points, but it's very nice to respond to your questions, and it's great. And you get my colleague David next week to solve all these problems. So this is superb. No, David's great. Highly recommend David's talk. I work with him, and he's really good. So that's cool.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Marcus, for all of this. I'm going to try to track down that graph that you showed at the very beginning with the different per capita versus total.
I can send that to you. No problem.
I'd love that. I'd love to get that graph.
Send me an email if I forget.
All right. Thank you. A lot of people are saying thank you here in the chat. So really,
thanks everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to everyone for their great questions, and we'll see you all next week. All the best.
Super. Thank you very much, Clark. Thank you, Jude.
Thank you.
I'm going to go up and see what my kids are up to, but
right.
Thanks a lot, guys, and I'll see you later on, okay?
Bye-bye.
Bye.